have two separable subminds linked to their respective hemispheres, which cooperate together in producing a single human consciousness. In such a case, the human mind would itself be a group mind. Applying this notion of a group mind to the Trinity, we must, if we're to remain biblically orthodox, maintain that the minds of the persons of the Trinity are more than mere subminds, which either never come to self-consciousness or else share a common mental state as a single self-consciousness. For such a view is incompatible with the persons existing in an I-thou relationship with one another. On such a view, there really is only one person, which God is. In order to be theologically acceptable, group mind monotheism will have to be construed dynamically as a process in which the sub-minds emerge into self-consciousness to replace the single trinitarian self-consciousness. In other words, what group mind monotheism offers is a strikingly modern version of the old Logos doctrine of the Greek apologists. The divine monarchy, that is the single self-consciousness of the Trinity, contains within itself an immanent Logos, a submind, which at the beginning of the creation of the world is deployed into the divine economy. That is to say, the subminds emerge into self-consciousness in replacement of the former single self-consciousness. It sounds just like the Logos doctrine. This provocative model gives some sense to the otherwise very difficult idea of the Father's begetting the Son in his divine nature. On the other hand, if we think of the primal self-consciousness of the Godhead as the Father, then the model requires that the person of the Father expires in the emergence of the three subminds into self-consciousness. In order to avoid this unwelcome implication, one would need to think of some way in which the Father's personal identity is preserved through the deployment of the divine economy, just as a patient survives a commiseratomy. The whole model depends, of course, upon the very controversial notion of subminds and their emergence into distinct persons. If we do not equate minds with persons, then the result of the deployment of the divine economy will be merely one person with three minds, which falls short of the doctrine of the Trinity. But if, as seems plausible, we understand minds and persons to exist in a one-to-one correspondence, then the emergence of three distinct persons raises once again the specter of tritheism. The driving force behind group mind monotheism was to preserve the unity of God's being in a way functional monotheism could not. But once the divine economy has been deployed, the group mind has lapsed away, and it is unclear why we do not have now three gods in the place of one. We finally then come to Trinity monotheism, which holds that while the persons of the Trinity are divine, it is the Trinity as a whole which is properly God. If this view is to be orthodox, it must hold that the Trinity alone is God and that the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, while divine, are not gods. Leftow presents the following challenge to this view, and I think rather than read the quotation, we'll just look at the diagram. On Trinity monotheism, either the Trinity is a fourth instance of the divine nature or the Trinity is not a fourth instance of the divine nature. Now, if you say that the Trinity is a fourth instance of the divine nature, then it follows that there are four gods, namely the Father, Son, Holy Spirit, and the Trinity, all being instances of the divine nature, and so you have not a Trinity, but a quaternity. On the other hand, if you say the Trinity is not a fourth instance of the divine nature, then either the Trinity is divine or the Trinity is not divine. Now, if you say the Trinity is not divine, then you have abandoned Trinity monotheism, because Trinity monotheism identifies God and the Trinity. But if you say that the Trinity is divine, then either there is one way to be divine or there's more than one way. There are two ways to be divine. Now, if you say that there is one way to be divine, then Either only the Trinity is God and the persons are not divine, which seems unacceptable, or only the persons are divine and the Trinity is not divine, which is self-contradictory. So there cannot just be one way to be divine. But if you say that there are two ways to be divine, then this leads to what Leftow calls Plantingian Arianism. And this is Cornelius Plantinga, not Alvin Plantinga, who is accused of this dread heresy. Well, what is Plantingian heresy? Plantingian Arianism. What is Plantingian Arianism? Well, Leftow defines it as the positing of more than one way to be divine. Well, that's uninformative. What we want to know is why the view is objectionable. Leftow responds, if we take the Trinity's claim to be God seriously, we wind up downgrading the person's deity and or being unorthodox. The alleged problem then is that if only the Trinity exemplifies the complete divine nature, then the way in which the persons are divine is less than fully divine. So if there are two ways to be divine, and the Trinity is divine by virtue of exemplifying the complete divine nature, then the way in which the persons are divine is less than being fully divine. Now, what we'll do now is take a break, and then we'll come back and look at this challenge to Trinity monotheism. We left off by considering the alternative of Trinity monotheism, which identifies the Trinity with God. And we saw that Leftow objects to this because he says if the Trinity is divine and the persons are divine, then there must be more than one way of being divine, and this will lead to a sort of downgraded divinity of the persons. This inference would follow, however, if there were but one way to be divine, namely by exemplifying the divine nature. But the position asserts that there is more than one way to be divine. The persons are divine not in virtue of exemplifying the divine nature, because the divine nature is identified with the nature that the Trinity exemplifies as a whole. The Trinity is God. So the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit are not instances of the divine nature, and that is why there are not three gods. The Trinity is the sole instance of the divine nature, and therefore there is but one God. So while the statement, the Trinity is God, is an identity statement, statements about the persons, like the Father is God, are not identity statements. Rather, they perform other functions, such as ascribing a title or an office to a person, like Belshazzar is king, which is not incompatible with there being co-regents, or ascribing a property to a person, a way of saying the Father is divine, as one might say Belshazzar is regal. So if the persons are not divine in virtue of being instances of the divine nature, in virtue of what are they divine? Consider an analogy. One way of being feline is to exemplify the nature of a cat. But there are other ways to be feline as well. A cat's DNA or skeleton is feline, even if neither is a cat. Nor is this a sort of downgraded or attenuated felinity. A cat's skeleton is fully and unambiguously feline. Indeed, a cat just is a feline animal. And as a cat's skeleton is a feline skeleton. Now, if a cat is feline in virtue of being an instance of the cat nature, in virtue of what is a cat's DNA or skeleton feline? One plausible answer is that they are parts of a cat. Now, I do think this would need to be qualified. After all, the atoms and molecules that make up a cat are also parts of a cat, but those would not be feline. There's nothing feline about carbon atoms, for example. But I think what we could say is the answer that the skeleton, the DNA, etc., are feline is because they are distinctive parts of the cat. That is to say, they are parts of a cat which are unique to the cat family. so that a paleontologist or a biologist presented with these parts